I'm Tim Ventura, and we're joined today by Dr. John B. Alexander, retired Army colonel and a key figure in over 5 decades of research into UFOs, remote viewing, near-death experiences, psychokinesis, and much more. Dr. Alexander is best known as a leading advocate for the development of non-lethal weapons and military applications of the paranormal. He's written and lectured on UFOs, researched paranormal anomalies like remote viewing, the Hutchison Effect, Skinwalker Ranch, and has appeared globally on numerous media venues over a period of decades. So, John, thank you so much for joining me today. Welcome, sir. Welcome. Okay, wonderful. Well, I should apologize for the questions. I mean, I've heard you on Coast a million times, so I guess, yeah, Men Who Stare at Goats is not even close. I thought about it and I was like, you know what, maybe he just embellished a hell of a lot. So
drop this a bit. Okay. Well,
yeah.
no, the issue wasn't Coast. It's just that did not have anything to do with remote viewing per se. Art Bell was great. As I mentioned, I was the first guest on Area 2000, which was the forerunner of Coast to Coast.
Oh, I didn't know that. I never even heard of Area 2000.
Yeah, no, it was about 92 or so. Somewhere in, no, wait a minute, when we came here in 95, I would have been about 95.
I know this may sound odd, but I would absolutely love, I don't know how I would pursue this either. I would love to do something on Coast to Coast AM. I think I went on Coast twice, and then I got suckered into managing Richard C. Hoagland's website for about four or 5 years. But I really felt like in the 90s, right, way before I went on, I used to, I had this, I don't, sorry, I know I'm digressing. I had this piece of crap VW Bug, and it only had an AM radio in it, right? This old 1960 something VW Bug. And my college job, I would commute home at night, and so I'd listen to Rush Limbaugh in the morning because everybody was listening to Rush, and then it was still on AM at night, and I'd listen to Coast. And and over time I lost Rush. I said, "Oh, screw that! I'm tired of him." But with Art Bell, it was just like there was this feeling that it was like if you missed an episode, the world might change right then and there.
Well, what you need to know, I knew Art pretty well, and he was an entertainer, and he knew exactly what he was doing, and particularly like the remote viewing. Oh, is that true? I mean, he'd done the same program umpteen times, but always act like it was new, and how could we possibly be here? He had a very, very good feel for the audience, and now one time I think he was number 4 of all talk shows in the country. He was huge.
Coast was giant, and I hope I'm not digressing too much. I would love to talk with you a bit about this. Maybe I could use this for something else. But the thing that got me about Coast was he created a cottage industry. And he created, I guess, almost what you might call the circuit. I mean, in a way, it's like he tapped into this circuit of speakers, but he kind of created it as well, And so the thing that got me though was it felt like there was this period of time where it really worked. It was that post-Cold War period, where there was still that heaviness about government and conspiracies and black projects and things that we kind of didn't know. And he tapped into that vibe, but it wasn't necessarily about UFOs. I mean, you could say, well, it's, he lived next to Area 51 and all that, but the majority of what he covered was stuff like remote viewing. He did that,
So he had a wide range of topics. And like I say, but played his audience like a harp.
He did. Well, not just him. There were a couple. There were a couple. I remember your shows. Your shows were amazing. And then there was the other fellow, I forgot his name, but he also talked about remote viewing. And I think he's out in Hawaii now. And so, that kind of played a big role there, right? It was this idea of, what was actually happening with the psychic spies back in the day. But then he also had, like, with Richard C. Hoagland, Richard was putting out new content. Every time NASA had a mission, Richard had something to do with it, And they had a couple big ones. I remember they had what was it? They had a probe that crashed into Mars in like 96. And and it was like this live countdown, and then bam, it goes silent on the other end, So
Oh, that hasn't happened since yesterday,
yeah, it's
hitting the asteroid.
well, yeah, that was intentional though.
Yeah.
They're testing their planetary defense system, right? So
Well, a friend of mine actually came up with that in the 90s when I was still at Los Alamos. The first guy to do that or suggest it was John Dale Solo, who was a genius at Atlanta, and he was widely disparaged for, oh, this is just the nukes guys looking for a new mission now that the Cold War is over. And said, no, that's really serious. It might take a big notch on some of those chunks that are flying around in space and get into near Earth orbit.
yeah, I mean, I'm really excited about I think they're calling it the NewSpace industry, right? And I've done a lot of interviews on that, and there's so much surging forward all at once. For me, it's really exciting. It felt like everything was kind of bottled up for over 20 years. It was just kind of waiting. And the impression that I get is that it was SpaceX that was kind of the tipping point. It was just Elon Musk being crazy. And I think, I don't know, the impression that I get is that he inspired people. He showed them that it could be done, I guess, but maybe I'm being too.
I would put probably Burt Rutan at the
Well,
top of
yeah,
the list. He's the one who won the X Prize. I was actually at what became Mojave when he put Mike Melville into space the first time, which was not when he won, because he hadn't even signed up for the X Prize at that time, and you had to be registered and then do it twice. But I was there like I say, the day he put Mike Melville into space, the first total civilian operation.
yeah. Well, that's an excellent point. And Rutan he did everything different too. They were built more like aircraft, if I understand it right. It was kind of a fiberglass body, very different approach to.
Oh, I was there when he also announced what he was going to see. What Burt did that was different. Most people tell you what they're going to do in the future. It's got money. Burt told you what he did do. We've already done that. And so, yeah, long before the launch, there was a meeting there at Scaled in Mojave. And by the way, the concept came from a dream, literally, and I know that. He woke up one night and said, "Oh, that's it." So the problem was reentry, and what you'd had to do was move the ailerons back, where you could make them maneuverable. And the idea was the shuttlecock, which is what allowed the Spaceship One to come back in.
Yeah.
But anyway, he was giving his whole talk and said, here's that and how it would work, and then he drops the curtain, and there's Spaceship One. It hadn't been in space yet, but just sitting there, and they moved the thing to show how that was done. Then the things open up, and there goes the white knight, which was the launch vehicle, goes down the runway and takes off.
Well, see, that's something that most people don't know about you. You travel. I mean, you are a busy person, you know, and in fact, you showed me I call it the travel guide, right? The John Alexander travel guide. And I think you were saying, I was looking at it for my interview notes, you've been to over 100 countries, but it may be more than that. That was why I didn't want to put a number on it.
Well,
I mean,
I'm not even sure what that number is, but it's well over 100 now. Yeah.
yeah. So you've been all over the world. I mean, now, was that related to, I mean, because again, I know you've been exploring the paranormal and exploring all these esoteric experiences. Was some of that part of that or was it just vacation travel?
Oh, no, it's all of the above. And even when we're out, we usually, as I said, I've been to all 8 continents. And yes, there are 8, not 7. Do you know what the 8th is?
No, I'm not sure. Let me see. I was going to say Antarctica, but I think that's 7, right?
No, that was 7. No, it is Zealandia. You see, the assumption always was that Australia and that New Zealand kind of broke away from Australia. And about maybe 5 years ago or so now, they said, no, this is a separate continent, most of which is still underwater. But a number of the islands that go on up into the archipelago and whatnot, but it was proclaimed to be a separate continent.
Mm. Now, with all of these explorations, and I know you've done, I mean, you've explored Skinwalker Ranch and all of those things as well, stuff that's here inside of the US, but did traveling around the world, did these global travels, did you find anything that was paradigm changing, or did it reinforce maybe what you already knew, or was it just kind of, I guess?
Well, I've seen weird shit in many places. I was asked recently, what would be the most? And I said, well, I'm not sure. However, I was reminded of stuff we saw in voodoo in West Africa, and where they were defying the laws of thermodynamics, with people standing in the fire, sitting in the fire, eating the fire, and closer than from me to the screen, and when I was filming this, and yeah, it was hot, really.
Okay, so
And
that's not fire walking. So fire walking, I've read descriptions of it, and they say if you're relatively quick and you don't step too hard, the coals, basically the coals will protect you, or the ashes will protect you from the
welcome to
coals.
bullshit. And I have done fire walking. In fact, back when we were doing the stuff in, well, we had a session, say in the morning, we taught people how to break boards using typical karate, and these were naive subjects. In the afternoon, spoon bending sorts of things, and at night did fire walking. This was back when Tony Robbins was still not known. And no, you do not get protection from the thing. You do see and feel a significant consciousness shift. And yeah, people do get burned if it doesn't go wrong. So what is true is that it is fairly quickly, depending on the length. Having said that, I saw the amusing Randy, who always claims that he's never seen anything. And I think it was India, and they had watched the people. There was no magic stuff they put on their feet or anything, and walked down this thing, or to stand in the fire, just standing there. We got this crap when we were, like I say, in let's see, that was in Togo, I think, maybe Benin, again in West Africa. And people come up and says, well, maybe they have this magic stuff that they put on their feet that protects them or something. And you go, these are folks, the poverty level looks up to dirt. No, they haven't got funding to go out and do specialized stuff. The other piece, and I've got some video on, for instance, the head shaman who was doing this, and you see him take hold of this thing, and the flame, his face disappears in the flames, And when he pulls it away, you say he's got long whiskers and no singeing or anything like that. So yeah, now they can come up with all kinds of preposterous things, and the coating of one's feet from ashes is one of those preposterous things. And yeah, people did get burned. I mean, if you make a mistake, and that is not something to be taken lightly, but you will pay a price.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that makes sense. Again, these travels are amazing. The one that's on my list, one of my bucket list places, I think I sent you this video, was Mount Roraima down in Venezuela, I think, or Peru. And that's that one, it's that 2 billion-year-old plateau. They're saying it's half as old as the age of the Earth. What was they said, compared to that, Everest is only like 200 million years old. So this thing is old. It's the oldest currently existing part of the Earth, from what they've said. I don't know if you ever heard of that? That's
have heard of it, have not been. Venezuela is one of the few countries we have not been in.
And I could be mistaken about the
Colombia.
country, but I'll look that up and send that to you
We've
again.
been throughout the Andes in Peru, and in particular in Ecuador.
Now, so were you able to explore consciousness in those places? Because again, that's, and I,
Well, familiar with ayahuasca?
yes, not
Yeah.
personally, but yes, I've
Oh
read
yeah,
a lot about
we
it.
were doing it. My wife's a devotee. I've tried it a couple times. Don't much care for it, but no, that primarily was in the Amazonian region, but have been in particularly around Iquitos and that area. In Ecuador, we were there with a Shuar. I don't know if you know them. They used to be the Javaro. They were noted for making your head real small.
Okay. Yeah.
And whether they still do or not is apparently questionable. But having said that, yeah, like I say, I am firmly convinced, having been in many ayahuasca ceremonies, that the issue is not psychopharmacology. The things that you see, I have seen people drink huge amounts and have no effect. I've also, particularly in Brazil, we were at a Santo Daime ceremony, and they had a ex-Jesuit priest with us who was acting as a translator, and he had transformational experiences and just sipping a fairly weak tea of ayahuasca.
Oh, okay. So that's, I've seen this in regular science too. And I think this is one of the things, and I guess you'd call them exceptions, right? And so experimental data is never clean, and real life is never clean. And I think that's really interesting. That probably, like with your remote viewing work back in the day, you guys probably saw the same thing. There's so much noise, right? And I think, we end up throwing out data with noise because we don't understand it. What you're saying about ayahuasca, that sounds like pretty profound, but it's one of those things that, it may be considered noise to a lot of people, I guess.
Well, ask Rogers from the Green Bay Packers. He says ayahuasca changed his game.
Okay.
Has now admitted going down a couple of times and said, yeah, it changed his, and he was already a great quarterback.
Yeah. No, it's incredibly interesting. It's interesting, all of this. And I've heard that there are actually a number of different substances and then meditation rituals. And some people, like my first wife did, she did Native American sweat lodges, and people have spiritual experiences in those as well.
Yep.
So
I'm familiar with that.
Oh, okay. And I guess in some of those they do peyote, but I don't think she ever did that. She said that most of the time there's nothing there. They just do the sweat lodge, and that by itself, induces trance states and and experiences, I guess.
Well, I've done. I don't know if you want me to go to a whole program on consciousness. We can do that. I used to have a sensory deprivation tank, for instance, back when I was in Northern Virginia, and people have out of body experiences and major things. Do you know John Lilly?
No, I'm not familiar with it.
Well, read Lilly on dolphins or the scientists or whatever. He was a great one of leading the interspecies communications work with dolphins. But before that, he was the one who was one of the inventors of sensory deprivation tanks. He was also one of, I think it was about 20 or 25 doctors who actually had legal permission to study LSD. And all
Okay.
of those experiments back at National Institute of Health. But then I don't know. John was one of the most amazing people I had the good fortune of meeting, actually.
Yeah, no, it is tremendously interesting. Well, the thing that intrigued me also was you were talking about this common link, this common theme of consciousness, right, being pervasive with all of these different things. You know, and again, usually I do an intro and all that, and we can come back to that. I guess I will add that later after the fact. But one of the things that, well, the Hutchison Effect, right? And that was one that I was involved with, because I studied John, and I went up to Richmond, or I went up to his house several times. And I know you had studied that, and I think you came to the same conclusion that George Hathaway did. And George is firmly convinced that that is based on John. It's based on consciousness. We did a conference where George Hathaway spent probably an hour explaining in detail how it was connected to John's psyche, and as John grew and changed as a person, the effect.
Well, as George mentioned that. Now, George is a good friend.
Okay.
And in fact, I'd recommend his book, Mindbender, where he wrote about, what was going on with John. In fact, it was because of George and Alex Pizarro, who has since transitioned, that I was at INSCOM at the time, got involved in replicating what they had recorded. There's a videotape available of an amazing number of physical effects. You've probably seen it, but things floating at the moon.
Yeah.
One of the problems was a wide range of effects. It wasn't my money, but I'm the one who got the money to Alex and George to. You see, one of the problems was when John invented this stuff, he was renting an apartment, working in a basement, and just screwing up the electronics, everybody's television, because of the crap he was doing. If you saw his stuff with Jacob's ladders and Tesla coils and all kinds of crap like that, raising a huge amount of potential that was disrupting the local TV. So people said, "You out, we're not going to put up with that." So we set up a place where he did replication. If you're interested in the story, it was kind of interesting. What we had done is I had a number of metal samples and had cut them in half and stored half at Fort Belvoir, and half the other went to John, who was in Vancouver, where it was set up. And when we did that, I also gave him some molybdenum rods that I had received from, if you know Jack Houck, from the metal bending, because Jack was a good friend. And his point was, with molybdenum, it was one of the few substances that they never, ever had any bending on. And the supposition was why that was done. It was the way they were manufactured. But the point was that I gave one of those rods to them, and it came back with a slight S curve in it. The other thing was we're supposed to do show and tell. And I was bringing in 5 other scientists, 2 from Los Alamos, and the other 3 were like me from the intelligence community. And they were going to do show and tell. We said, okay, you got to do proof of principle. And so I arrived a day ahead of everybody else just to make sure everything was set up and running. And they met me, Alex and John met me at the airport, very excited. They said, "Oh yeah, we had this thing levitating. So we just turned it off. We didn't move anything of that." So the idea was that all the settings are the same. We will just turn it back on and we'll probably get levitation again. What happened was the following day, everybody's there. Not only did it not levitate, but they had a power conditioning system that literally burned up on the spot.
Mm.
And it's just fun. And the point was, for the entire period, they were never ever able to replicate it, even though everything was sitting there exactly as they said they had seen it. Now, I believe it happened. And there were a host of incidents that happened. And one of the problems was the variation. That wasn't, purely it wasn't a magnetic effect. One of them that they had was a PVC pipe that they were holding in the thing, and it, parts of it just disintegrated. They had a crankshaft that was exposed to the field, and took it to BC Hydro for testing after the effect. And one end was case hardened steel, the other was like lead. It was that much differential within the same piece of metal. You may have seen the one that I thought was interesting. They have a board with a rat tail file between it, gets exposed to the field. And it's like that was a filament on, what you'd expect on a light bulb. And it glows and then disintegrate. One of the most interesting aspects was they said as soon as it happened, they reached in and it was cold, even though clearly it looked like heat. Now, the question about John's consciousness, because that's exactly what I asked him. I said, "Are you part of the system?" And he says, "Yes." Now, George might vary because I think we are looking at a large psychokinetic effect that may be amplified by some mechanism that we don't understand. And the problem with John was inconsistency. You could not do it reliably. But what happened was that he would say, "Oh yes," he says, "I would get excited and then an event would happen." When I first talked to George about it, he says, "No," he says, "an event would happen and then he would get excited." And of course, we're talking a very short integer of time on that. But having said that, yeah, I'm one of the ones who was firmly convinced that something was going on. The problem was could not control it.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. That's everything I've seen is the same, and it seemed to appear randomly. And now, did you see any of these events happen, or was it always just because I know they were up late nights and all that kind of stuff, doing it on
I
their own?
guess I would have to say no. I saw the power conditioner burn up, and we watched it for hours. Having said that, like I say, the molybdenum rod that we got back, that was my rod, and yeah, it had the curve on it, and nothing else could do it. One supposition is they gripped it somehow and exposed it to high heat. But we had explored the ends, and no, there was no place where some kind of clamps had been attached to it or anything. And as you know from talking to George, if you've seen the samples that he still has, it's just a wide range of, interestingly, things like you'd have one type of metal would be curved, and maybe a bolt going through it that's unaffected, or attached to wood, and pieces, some of it's affected, some of it's not. You saw many of the metal thing, particularly aluminum, they were just shredded. And
Yep.
Again, but you always got back to the problem of uncontrollable.
Yeah, that makes sense. So that brought you, it sounds like, and again, George seems like he's firmly in this camp now. in terms of saying John is part of the system. This is somehow tied to John's consciousness. So,
well, that's what I suspect. But I had done a lot of work in psychokinesis before that. This was bigger than anything we were doing with a metal bending or that sort of thing. But yeah, but enough other independent witnesses who had seen some of these things, and the tests that were being done on the residual material by independent sources that said something happened.
well, if it's okay, let me ask about UFOs and the UAP thing. I talked to you briefly on the phone last week, and you kind of suggested that what the government is investigating now, they're basically redoing work that's been done, or been done a couple of times. I mean, and that you guys investigated this too. You investigated this years ago.
Yeah, I did. I set up something called the Advanced Theoretical Physics Group with all the services involved, the intelligence community, aerospace. You had to have TSSCI level clearances, etc. And this ran from early the 80s. After I actually retired, I had one at Los Alamos following my retirement. But yeah, when you look at what Lou puts out as, here are the 5 things that, anti-gravitational, instantaneous acceleration, low observables, transmedium thing, all of that was known.
Yeah, yeah.
And I know the difference was that they were able to get some higher level interest. But if you compare the issues, the one thing is they got funding. When I went to eventually, this was after several years, SDI was in full swing then, the Strategic Defense Initiative, and met with General Abramson. And so the interesting story was I was there, had people from various agencies with me, etc., as backup. And so I started and I was doing UFO 101. And after about 5 minutes, you go, wait, who are you guys really? So we went back around the room, said, here's who we are, what agencies we represented, that. And by the end, it was, okay, you got my attention, but I can't touch this. He had a $5 billion budget. We figured that if anybody's going to fund, this is an obvious logical area. He did say we're going to monitor more of space than ever has been monitored before. I remember we're talking 1980s now, not 2020 or beyond. And he said, if you can tell me what to look for, I can include algorithms, but I can't do funding because the quote was, I'm doing some pretty hairy stuff now, but if I get caught doing UFOs, they're going to just nail my budget. And without us, they did take $1 billion out of the budget because it was such a big program. It was an obvious target for every agency that needed money, and particularly all throughout DOD was looking for additional funds. And I don't know if you know how the budget game is played, and most people don't. This was one of the issues I have with Richard Dolan. I said, what you ought to do is take a decade off and learn how the system works. And it's terribly complex.
Yeah. Well, with your team, when you guys were investigating this, did you learn anything that hasn't been relearned? Yet, I guess.
No, bottom line, well, in fairness to the recent studies, they've got different sensor systems, of course, and recordings and things. So you've got new cases. But as far as anything different from a physics standpoint, no.
Yeah.
Like I say, all of the things we saw. Well, I like to give the Milton Torres case, which is not that well known, But in, I think it was 1957, he was stationed at Lakenheath, which is in the UK. And he was on strip alert, and he gets sent out and says, we got something. And it turns out the radar was showing something the size of an aircraft cover or carrier hovering over the UK. And he goes in and he gets ordered to fire Mighty Mouse missiles in those days. You know, and by the way, later in the Iranian case, we're looking at AIM-9 missiles, and there's a number of armed interactions that take it. But anyway, he rolls in on it and he goes to pickle Mighty Mouse. This thing's doomed. And in 2 sweeps of the radar, which is about 2 seconds, it is off the radar scope, which is 250 miles.
I think one of the blessings, and it's also kind of a curse of modern UAP research, is I think the reason that Elizondo and you know that group has been able to get the attention of the high level, and the reason that it's become maybe less stigmatized, is because they're so focused on the observable phenomenology, right? But I think that's also a curse, because it creates this almost like this dichotomy of there's stuff that's like, you know, post Nimitz era, right, where we're just saying, okay, something is going on, we don't know what, we're just going to examine, you know, on a purely scientific level as much as we could get. And then there's this massive body of work like your group did, like everyone else did before that. And you know, and a lot of it is equally valid, but then there's also a lot of myth and legend, right, that goes back to the beginning of the Cold War. And so
No, it goes back millennia. I mean, this is not a new phenomena. Yes, it's been happening all along, got those peaks and valleys from time to time, but literally thousands of years ago, back to Alexander the Great, talks about this in you know, when he was invading India region. Yeah, no, just definitely not new. The difference each is, I guess, the sensor systems. Now, when I wrote UFOs, Myths, Conspiracies, and Realities, I suggested there were 2 reasons to address the issue. One was national defense, and the other was airline safety, because there have been a number of close call interaction with civilian airliners, etc. I have emerged to the point where I say, I don't think this is a government issue. Frankly, I think it's too big for government. I use the comparison and say, whatever we're looking at, now this expands to the more consciousness area, but whatever we're looking at is more complex than cancer. So that when you talk from a funding perspective, you know, we go, wow, 22 million. Well, 22 million in Pentagon funding, we're talking, you know, pocket change, you know, by comparison. But if you compare, you know, hundreds of billions in cancer research, and yeah, things have improved there. But when you compare that to what we're looking at here with this complexity of what we're looking at, I mean, you know, and try to solve these massive problems. The other is one of the things, now the government brings certain things to the table, and a lot of that is sensor systems, national collection capabilities, etc. And a lot of brain power, because you have access to national labs and a lot of very smart people looking at it. The problem, though, is this propensity to classify stuff. Yeah. And if you look now at, you know, the plethora, I mean, every day, literally, new videos are coming out. The flip side is, you know, with digital stuff, you can fake it as well. But there's enough legitimate there where you're having, you know, one of the things I talked to, I'll give an example and kind of take on Neil deGrasse Tyson, who gets a lot of airtime and whatnot, another guy from the UK. Oh, we're just looking at the videos or fun. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about multi-sensory data. And when you look at the videos that are coming in, this is confirmation of what's happening. It is not the evidence per se.
Yeah, that's a good point. It is multisensory, right? So they're getting an infrared, they're getting on a visual, they're getting on a radar. With the Nimitz and the Princeton encounter, I think they're saying it set off an anti-ballistic missile warning system, and they took that as an indicator that there was something up in space. So there's a lot going on there. But I think one of the things, and I think you've suggested this, I know Dr. Eric Davis has suggested this also, that it's somehow tied into consciousness, I guess. And in his
Well,
case,
no, frankly, Jacques was the one who first started talking to us, passports of Magonia. And we've been talking about this for decades before Eric came along. But yeah, we certainly do. I'll give you one of the classic ones that, well, I gave the Milton Torres case, but there he was actually going to fire. But in the case over Tehran, where Girani was going to, he said he's going to come in and fire an AIM-9 missile. And this is a sighting that's being seen from multiple locations and whatnot. And they go in, and communication shot says when he went to fire the AIM-9 missile, all of a sudden his weapon systems are shut down. Well, the question there, of course, is, was whatever this was aware of a change in consciousness, or when a switch was flipped, we now know what, attack radars are, where they are. Are they just monitoring, or is it in launch mode, etc.? But nonetheless, it seemed to be that it sensed this change and responded accordingly, shut him off. Now, what's of interest to me in that particular case is that my last assignment was Director of Advanced System Concepts for the Army. As such, we had all of the tactical directed energy, lasers, high power, microwaves, and particle beam. But the point is, I know how to turn you off. Now, what happens to Girani is he turns and he comes back and his systems come back up. I don't know how to turn you back on again.
okay.
So, yeah, I know how to burn you out, got that aspect of it, but just flipping a switch and then reactivating, that's a piece I do not yet know how to do. I don't think we have that, because we always talk about, in the ICBM kinds of things, intercept. It's how do you shut down the system? And most of these are just, you burn them up somehow.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. And now another aspect of this, and this isn't necessarily consciousness, but last year I really got into the UFOs and nukes. That was the book, and you've probably read that many
Bob
times.
Hastings, yep.
Yeah, I really got into that, and I found new material out there on the internet that meshed with things that Hastings had already written in the past. And so, he covered a number of classic cases. The thing that interested me, though, was Hastings really dug into, he had stories about sightings over Navy shipyards where carriers were being built and maintained, submarine yards, nuclear weapons depots, transports. I mean, anything related to nukes seemed to have an increase in sightings,
Well, I'm not sure I agree with that, because his focus was looking at nukes. And it's like looking for red cars. If you start looking for red cars, you're going to see more red cars. That is not to say these events didn't happen. Yeah, they did. And it was ubiquitous. Bob Salas and the whole faded giant things from the Northern Tier, where the missile systems were shut down. The one that I like that shows maybe a similar understanding was over Russia. George Knapp brought this case back, where you had over Ukraine the UFO hovering for hours, hundreds of witnesses seeing it. And then in their case, remember ours, the missiles were shut down. In theirs, the missiles started spinning up. And the lieutenant colonel says, "Oh my God, we're about to start World War III and I can't stop it." And then it stopped. It was a Colonel Sokolov who was assigned to figuring out what had happened, and they literally disassembled the base. The huge difference, in my view, was in the American system, we trusted the launch control officers, so we had a decentralized system. Soviets did not trust their people, so theirs was centralized, and from Moscow was the only one who could do the, actually launch. Whatever this is, seem to understand the difference and send warning messages, if you will.
Yeah. So this is big, and it's connected to us, I guess. And that's what makes it so interesting is, this UAP story, I mean, there's a phenomenology to it, but then the more we learn about it, it seems like it's showing us something about ourselves. And I guess that comes right back to what you work with.
Yeah, but one of the key things, in my view, is that the phenomena morphs. If you go back to 1800s, for instance, you had airships that people were talking to, and I mean, kind of like literally big ships floating in the air. You can fast forward, even in our lifetimes, the aspects have been morphing. There's a case that Jacques has that I really liked, and that was early 1900s in the state of Washington. A guy was driving around the corner and he saw this UFO hovering there. He says it had a heptagonal thing. And the quote was, "I could see every rivet." Now you go that. What we know now is no way in hell would a spaceship have rivets per se. It was advanced for that period of time and within reasonable consciousness, but clearly when it was not 1,000 years, let alone 50 years in advance, as we now know the spaceships would never have rivets. And you just watch the phenomena keeps morphing. One of the things I've talked about, as you know, at the ranch, this intelligent, the precognitive sentient phenomena, where it seems to know what you're doing and just staying one step ahead. You would get something presented, and then it would say, "Oh, you like that? Try this."
Well, and that's interesting. Actually, that was I had a bunch of questions about that because as I was doing research for this, you were at the ranch from the very beginning. They were saying when Bob Bigelow went to buy it, you were actually in the car with him. So like from the very beginning of that.
Well, we flew up on Bob's plane, but yeah, no, I spent the night. I was the first one from NIDS to actually spend the night up there. Got a number of mosquito bites. That's about the most exciting thing that happened. But over time, very, very strange things definitely did happen at the ranch and continue. Had dinner recently with Brendan Fugel, and they just keep recording new events. But my point in the precognitive sentient phenomena was, like I say, whatever it is, and that's a very generic thing, but it's definitely in control. And it kept presenting things, and it seemed to know how we would respond before the event occurred. You're probably familiar with the calf that was totally mutilated. And, that's one of the classic cases there. Absolutely happened. What happened, Terry goes out, finds a newborn calf, tags it, weighs it. They do that to associate it with the mother, drives a flat, wide open field, a couple 100 meters away, finds another calf, weighs it, comes back, and calf one is dead. Not only is it dead, it's been eviscerated and exsanguinated and whatnot. And the skeptics say, "Oh, the blood just ran into the ground." So we had flown George Annette, who was our veterinarian up there, and looked at it, and I said, "Go get blood." There was a slaughterhouse nearby. and they took blood back and poured it on the ground. And weeks later, you say, blood's poured on the ground here. So this idea that the exsanguination was just absorbed, just totally ridiculous.
Well, do you think that there's something, I mean, obviously there's something special about Skinwalker Ranch. Do you have any ideas what that might be? I mean, is there something about that location?
No, there are, and I don't think it's totally unique. Very strange things happen, I can guarantee that. But there are other places in the world. I was watching a program literally last night of incident in the Sierra Mountains in California, where they're interacting with physically with some huge somethings that can't be seen, and yeah, like I say, with all of these phenomena, one of the interesting things is how it changes and stays a step ahead. But again, not beyond our ability to imagine it, which suggests, I mean, you almost get back to Forbidden Planet, right? The id, the creating.
Oh, well, maybe. I mean, yeah, it's well, and again, this goes back to this connection to us, right? I mean,
Yeah.
do you think it's trying to teach us something, or is it more of like a mirror, like a reflection of,
I
like
have
you were saying, Forbidden
no
Planet?
idea. The only thing I can say is it's in control, whatever.
Well, and that comes, a lot of this seems like it kind of dovetails in. One of my favorite movies is the Mothman Prophecies, the movie, which is very different than the book, but there was something about that movie, and when I saw that, I said, yeah, I've had stuff like this happen, and I think one of the challenges is with any of this stuff, it doesn't happen on demand, and it doesn't all happen at once, right? UFOs don't
But
just appear one day to the next. These are kind of like exceptions events.
well, I don't
And
know. You give Gulf Breeze as a classic example where they reappeared for a long period of time. Uh, yeah, I went down there once, and yeah, just kind of continuously appeared for enough so. I like Bruce Maccabee talked to us, says whatever is happening was enough to make people change their lifestyle, where they would
mm,
literally go out every night, sit on the beach, and wait for events to happen. And they were recurring with a periodicity, commensurate with keeping that up. If it died off too much, obviously they're going to go away. Now, that was one of the issues for the ranch, is we did see some kind of cyclical nature. Don't know what it was, but yeah, if you look too hard, you tended not to see. It was when you were not expecting it, something new would happen.
I see what you mean. Well, with Gulf Breeze, that's another one that was over the ocean, right? And I've heard that there's
Yeah.
some connection with, now this is the UFO UAP thing, but I've heard that there's some connection with the ocean. But
Well, Washington, if you look at the cases in northern New York, Hudson Valley, even, you hear about them hovering over reservoirs and whatnot. So, yeah, it's one of the anecdotal tales that's just not understood.
yeah, there's so much, there. Well, so now with Bigelow, as I understand things, he's kind of wrapped up Skinwalker Ranch. He's moved on to Bix. And that one is about the survival of the human consciousness after death. Now, are you're involved with that one, right? Or
No, well, yes and no, but understand when NIDS was first formed, National Institute for Discovery Science, it had supposedly two branches. One was continuation of consciousness, and the other one was UFOs. So this is not new. This did come about actually to a full up thing. I was involved in the embryonic stages and chose not to accept a job with them, but Column has. But this has been a long term interest. Having said that, it did the initial meetings that happened literally the day after his wife Diane's funeral. And but he has had interest, had been contact, he'd been working with mediums long before NIDS. I was kind of surprised, in fact, when we talked about it, to find out how many different mediums he had worked with in the past. And I think that worth getting, particular stuff with Gary Schwartz is doing at the University of Arizona. A lot of really serious effort. In fact, I just came back from the International Association of Near-Death Studies had its annual meeting. And I used to be, in fairness, I used to be the president of the organization many, many years ago, 30 some years ago. At the time that we were involved with, Raymond Moody wasn't associated. My mentor was not, and they're the ones who started. That's Kubler-Ross, but Ken Ring and Bruce Grayson, people who were studying it, we would never have touched mediums. I mean, it was strictly looking at people who had a certain experience for a brief period of time, were describing the other side and coming back. Now, mediums like Suzanne Gaisman are the star presenters at these things, and the evidence on, let's say, the evidence-based mediumship has just moved a tremendous amount in the last couple of decades.
Yeah, yeah. It seems like a lot of these stigmas are starting to erode, and I think that's a good thing, right? It's good for honest exploration of it. But you know, same thing with the UFO. I think that the UAP approach to it is starting to finally erode stigmas. And
well, that I think is a critical issue, and I've said for decades, this thing I've been trying to do is to assist in getting the best and brightest to get involved in serious studies without risking their reputation and livelihood. And so that I think is the biggest thing that's happened, you know, from 2017 on, when the UFO thing was first hit New York Times, was removing or diminishing the stigma. By the way, it has not totally gone away. And I mean, if you talk to fighter pilots and that, they go, yeah, right. You know,
yeah, I've heard that. I've heard that. They're still, yeah, they're still, and I'm sure no matter how many laws they pass for whistleblowers and things like that, right? It's always going to be there a little bit. There's going to be some.
It still has not shifted, and as we like to say, it's not career enhancing. Let me give a classic example there. When we created the Army Research Laboratory, this is back in the 80s, and I became the director of advanced system concepts there. My boss was a 2-star air defense officer. And I had already been running this stuff before the creation of that. But I went to him and I started explaining to him. And as such, he had been at NORAD headquarters as a shift officer. They had a general officer who was always there in charge of, you know, this is NORAD, and, you know, we're worried about, this is the bad old days too, you know, we're worried about nuclear war at any moment. And he goes, no, never heard anything like that. Conversely, when you talk to people who actually, you know, ran the radar desks and things, that you learn pretty quickly you don't pass this information up. This is not going to be well received. So they just, it was happening. It didn't. In fact, it was interesting. I was at NORAD headquarters in Cheyenne Mountain one time. I thought I'd be a smart ass, and so I asked a question. I said, well, do you ever get things that, you know, change direction or rapidly accelerate? And they go, oh, you mean UFOs? Yes, but would not pursue it any further. And we're talking, you know, early 80s there. You know, they said, yeah, they knew it, but this was not something that was going to get moved forward. Again, the key issue across the board and globally is the potential for stigma looking at all of these phenomena.
Yeah, well, and so what you're saying about Cheyenne Mountain, then it sounds like, and when again when I was looking at the UFOs and nukes, I'd seen some reports kind of like this as well. I think people tend to believe, and who knows, maybe it's true that the CIA has some big box with all these reports and they know everything, but a lot of this stuff, if it doesn't get reported, nobody knows about it, and if it does get reported, a lot of those, again, back in like the 60s, right, with the Minuteman missile silos, the impression that I got was they would send out an intelligence officer to look, and he'd be looking at those guys going, how much of these guys had to drink, you know? And so I don't know. I mean,
I'm going to have to disagree.
okay.
First of all, one of the problems we have is that, for most people think Washington, all that bureaucracy is totally incompetent, except for UFOs where they're omniscient. This makes no sense whatsoever. No, I think what you found, and it's like with Beta Giant, they studied that intensely, but could not come up with an answer. And the answer was, we also had, I would tell you, we had a bin, I think in at least all the areas I was involved in, it was called Too Hard to Handle. And this is one of them. No, I'll give you an example. In the various schools we're in, looking at nuclear warfare and even chem bio, the weapons of mass destruction, at the average level, it just quickly gets too hard to consider. And so there are bins in there that you kind of agree, okay, and the answer with Beta Giant, well, if it happens again, we'll take an even harder look. But they looked at it very seriously and could not come up, to the best of my knowledge, with any explanation. If you want one that's going on right now, if you want is the Havana syndrome. That's one that's, just listening to the various explanations, they say, yeah, it's happening, but maybe only to a tiny subset of the people. It's not as broad as it's being reported, etc. And they pour resources into it. Now, I will also emphasize from the UFO standpoint and the government, I think it is so complex that there's a low probability of coming up to any, real resolution. So as a resource manager, and you're going to be the steward of lots and lots of money, depending on your level, how much are you willing to commit to something that you have a low probability of getting an answer, even if it is complex?
Yeah, that makes sense. Well, do you think that something like, I'm thinking back to the early days of the internet, they had SETI at home, right? And I've seen a couple of UFO tracking projects that are attempting this. The names I escape me, but do you think something that involves the public and provides structure for reporting might help of some kind?
Oh, it would definitely help, and it has to be involved. Back to the internet, I use a thing when we had the Delta Force, which is not the Delta Force most people know, but we had one of the first nets. We were communicating using the phone lines at 600 baud a minute. I mean, you literally watch each letter type out, so you can imagine how long it was. But it was very advanced, and there were a few people. Interestingly, one of those actually was Al Gore, who actually did have the vision to see where this could go. And most of the others were going, hey, don't bother me. It's and if you look where information and the whole AI thing that is now progressing, you watch the changes. One of the gee whiz figures that I saw recently is the total amount of data available or information in the world is doubling every 12 hours. So you're looking at asymptotic there, it's going straight up, and so it's impossible to handle it. Are there better ways to collect these things? Yeah, and I think Jacques has been doing some of this. One of the problems has been the bifurcation of all of these databases. People want to hold it. I don't know how many people have met. Oh, I forgot a picture. You know, this picture is going to prove UFOs, or I'm going to get $1 million now. Sorry, there's too many of those already exist. But as I've argued, my approach would be, as I said, the model should be the Human Genome Project. And that's one where you had a terribly complex issue. But what you had was numerous countries, many universities, the best and brightest involved in looking at how do you do billions of pairs of the genome and you know, mapping it. And they were successful and, you know, under time and under budget.
Yeah.
But the point was, the key issue was sharing data. And that's something you just don't see in these areas.
Well, and I was going to say with government, like you were saying, they have a propensity to classify everything, right? And
oh, but you got to remember, this is true in civilian industry as well. You know, keeping industrial secrets and whatnot, trying to continually get a leg up across the board. And in my view, that's not a way that you're going to be able to solve these terribly complex issues.
well, so when you were talking about these, and again, this is we're kind of straddling that line between consciousness and UFOs, I guess. But you were saying that these encounters go back millennia, and one of the things that I've heard people question is, you know, is there some kind of an intimate connection between the human race and these visitors, I guess, or do you think?
Well, wait, just to let you know, I come down against the ETH, or the
Okay,
extraterrestrial hypothesis. And the reason is not because the events don't happen, they do. It's that explanation is too simple.
okay,
Unless Earth happens to be on the galactic bucket list of places that ET's got to visit, you know, or whatnot. But if you look at the variety of cases, not a lot of hard evidence that these things occur, but I look more at a multi-dimensional, ultra-dimensional kind of explanation. And again, this gets into, why do we call this particular set ET? We've worked with psychokinesis. Well, how can you physically interact with that? The remote viewing that we mentioned, can consciousness go out and collect data and bring it back? You want a good one? Poltergeists and ghosts, if you will. You know, look at a postmortem communication, which is an area of interest to me now. By the way, this is one of these areas where that ought to be of interest to 100% of the population. You know, continuation of consciousness.
yeah,
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 you're all going to get a shot at it. And yet, if you look at the principal research, well, and you find traditional organizations that are very opposed, many of these are ones like Orthodox religions. So I've run into this in multiple areas, from the near-death studies, after-death communication, even ayahuasca, where you're dealing with multiple dimensions, and religions generally come down against. Now, my view is they want to be the arbiters of truth. You know, they do not like people who have direct connection with, you know, external sources that provide guidance and wisdom.
no, that makes sense. I would say the feeling that I have is death is one of those things where people seem to be touched by it, right? People that they love, people they care about pass in their own lives, and that's where that interest seems to develop, you know. And for some
Yeah, but
reason,
we don't say, I look at this from a commitment of resources standpoint, from a materialistic world and the Western world. By the way, our materialistic view is not the dominant one in the view. It's the dominant one in message traffic and things like that, but not necessarily the dominant view in the world. I go back to, you said, where I've traveled and met shamans all over the world and people, and they look, as I say, and in the West, we look at the real world and the spirit world as separate and distinct. When you're dealing with shamans, no, it's a continuum.
Okay.
And they can move seamlessly, yeah, back and forth, some better than others. I like Brazil as a specific example. I've done a lot of work there at very, very high levels. And the point is that their educational facilities are very much like Western universities and that. And yet they can integrate spiritism seamlessly and not see a conflict between it because it works. And that's what we've seen with many places in the world, healing and things like that, that are outside the norm. And the reason it's picked up is because it works.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, John, on that note, let me thank you so much for your time. Let me thank you genuinely and sincerely. It has been a true honor, sir. It has been a true honor.